I'm going to introduce the next panel in just a quick second. We also want to get voices and thoughts from all of you, of course, in this conversation. Jamie and I are both going to help orchestrate this and to involve you in that. So if you wonder why there are two of us up there, that's the reason for that. But without further ado, and I think we're actually in a great place actually to talk in a more forward-looking environment about understanding more deeply the environment within law enforcement and the impact that these encounters have on youth, as we heard yesterday. What would a new model look like? What are elements of progress that are being made fundamentally inside police departments now? What are the things that we haven't thought about that could be instructive in recreating a new environment, a new system for the relationships that are so important to us here today? In alphabetical, actually I'll do it from my left all the way down. With us for the conversation are Jonathan Masur, who is the John P. Wilson Professor of Law, and David and Celia Hilliard Research Scholar here at the University of Chicago Law School. Next to Jonathan is LaCreshia Birts, who is with the Black Youth Project here at the University of Chicago, and also with a terrific YMCA project called Bridging the Divide, which has connected youth and police together in conversation. So we'll want to hear from her on the progress of that work and what's next. We also want to welcome to the stage Demitrous Cook, who's the Chief of Police in Glenwood, Illinois. Next to the Chief is Chief Chris Magnus, who is Chief of Police in Richmond, California's Police Department. And on our far end, familiar to many of you here at the University of Chicago, is Adam Green, who's an Associate Professor of American History here at the university. Please join me in giving them a warm welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Jamie, I'm going to bounce it to you to get us underway.
So in the last panel, we had expressed from multiple perspectives a sense of how long, deep, resistant the history of these patterns has been, and how difficult it is to move the various institutions implicated in what happens to people on the street and in their homes. So I think we're kind of positioned to talk about, from your respective perspectives and experience, historical as well as present, what might be possible? You know, what's possible? And I'd like to turn first to Chris Magnus, who police chief in Richmond, East Bay, neighboring Oakland, who has been grappling very directly with these issues. And ask Chris, you know, as you listen to the last panel, what were you thinking?
It's been really interesting being here yesterday and today to hear some of the same issues we're obviously talking about out in California, in the Bay Area, across the country, but to hear it from the perspective of a lot of folks who are involved in community here in Chicago. There are obviously a lot of similarities to the discussion that's going on, and there's some differences. But you know, for me, one of the things that's really important is that while we continue to have these discussions, and while there is a lot of really appropriate, legitimate, and understandable anger, frustration, really sense of injustice that's being talked about and shared, we also have to find ways to move forward. Because at the end of the day, and literally at the end of today, we go our separate ways and the world continues on. And so what can we do at a community level, at an individual level, and of course at a state and national level to change some of these dynamics? How do we support each other in some of those efforts, and how can we start to shift the needle around some of these issues? And one of the great things about working in Richmond, where I've been for the last 10 years, is that it's a community that is, it's about 111,000, arguably with another 10 to 15,000 undocumented residents. It's in San Francisco Bay Area, but not at all like San Francisco. It's very low income, blue collar community, very racially diverse. It's over 80-some% non-white. Right now, predominantly Latino, though with a significant African American population as well. And we've been struggling with a lot of these issues, but also working as a community to try to figure out what some solutions might be to being able to create a safe community without compromising the rights or the respect that residents feel as members of the community. And what's nice about a city of, I guess, 110 to 120,000 is that you have maybe a little more opportunity to function in kind of an incubator, I guess you could say, to experiment a little bit. Perhaps a little easier in some ways than trying to reform a massive police department like, a New York or Chicago or many other cities around the country. And yet with more resources than what you have in a place like Ferguson or some of these small departments that you look at and you almost wonder where do you go from where they're at now. So, I've struggled with a lot of these issues because our community in Richmond really we're very concerned about safety and about crime. As recently as, 10, 15 years ago, we had 60 plus homicides a year. I mean, think about that for a community of 110,000 people. That's like puts us in the top, easily top 10 cities crime-wise per capita in the country. Hundreds of shootings, taking sometimes as many as 1 or 2 guns a day off the streets. That's really scary for folks who live there, regardless of what neighborhood they're in, regardless of what race they are, regardless of their income level. And so, there's a lot of pressure on police and community to address that kind of violence, and yet at the same time, it's a community that's also had really historically not good relationships between community members of color and police. And so, so we're trying to do this, a little bit of a balancing act where we start to shift the needle both on crime and on police-community relationships. So I've been in policing now most of my career, pretty much all of my career, 35 years now, it's hard to believe, and wanted to really try to incorporate some of the true concepts of what I believe are really need to be part of true community-based policing into the Richmond environment to see if we could accomplish both of those things. So some of the things, just cover quickly, that we've kind of focused on, first and foremost, is creating a climate of respect, both within the department where it has to exist if it's going to carry on out into the community, and also in the city. So that meant for us a couple of things, and none of this, I'll be really candid, none of this has been easy and none of this has come quickly. First of all, it's insisting on constitutional policing, which means, one of the things I did early on was just completely eliminate street teams. We don't have, I guess what you call in Chicago, the jump out guys, or some of the terminology. Sorry, it's a little different on the West Coast and where I'm working now, but we don't have street teams. We got rid of street teams because I think that's an invitation for violations, and it really detracts from any kind of meaningful relationship. And not only that, it's not effective in fighting crime. We also we don't practice anything even close to stop and frisk, because that sounds like, if you have probable cause to have contact with somebody, that's one thing. That's called constitutional policing. If you're just stopping somebody with the idea that you're going to find a reason now to justify that contact, that's unconstitutional. It really doesn't matter what state or city you're in. We don't do that. We don't allow our officers to do that. We also have adopted a model where we really try to listen to the community, and I think some of this was expressed earlier in some of the other discussion, but the idea that the community needs to define what it wants from police and what kind of relationship it wants with police. So officers are assigned to set geographic areas. They work those areas for extended periods of time, sometimes for several years or more. They're expected to build relationships, which means, that can be empty police rhetoric, except you actually have to evaluate what it is that you want, and you have to reward that those kinds of outcomes. So for us, that means we evaluate officers on the kind of relationships that they build with neighborhood groups and associations, in schools that are within their beats, in churches, which many of them are regular guests at, in community-based organizations and nonprofits. Those are where they're expected to make contacts and build relationships, and they are expected to identify what kind of problems the community sees as an issue in their particular neighborhoods and work with community to solve those problems. Some are easily solved, some more long-term. Interestingly, for example, one of the first things I discovered when I came to Richmond in one of the most difficult neighborhoods known as the Iron Triangle, that's literally received millions of dollars of funding to deal with high crime and poverty. But residents were exhausted and felt completely marginalized by city government in terms of their concerns. My assumption was their top concern would be homicides. And when my officers and I actually stopped to listen to what folks were expressing as their concern, their first concern, might surprise you, was abandoned cars. We had 6,000 abandoned cars on the streets of Richmond. And to them, those abandoned cars were a sign, a symptom of a city government that was kind of ignoring something that affected their quality of life on a day-to-day basis, that were scary, that was undesirable, that just represented a complete disinterest in their neighborhood. So one of the first things that we did as a police department was to get rid of all of those cars. You won't find an abandoned car really for more than 24 hours on the streets of Richmond today. That just doesn't exist. And we incorporate code enforcement, which deals with blight abatement, the physical environment, into the work that the police department does. Code enforcement and police work hand in hand on solving neighborhood problems with the help of residents. So it's that kind of respect for what neighbors are concerned about. The other, though, was this idea that officers had to start getting out of their cars and talking to people in a proactive way. And I don't just mean like sort of a mini shakedown or, what are you doing here and why are you out? I mean, actually engaging with people in a friendly, positive way. And it's funny because this even ties into training. One of the discoveries we've made, and I don't know why any of us would be surprised by this in the technology world that young folks in particular are growing up in today, but we have a lot of officers that really don't know how to talk to people. They're used to texting, they're used to texting their friends, social media. They learn in a police academy how to talk at people, give commands to people, but they don't actually know how to engage in a friendly conversation with people. And so, and that is a skill set. I mean, there's some good news here. We talked about training earlier, but I'm one of those folks who really believes that there are a lot of things that we can train police to do better, and that most officers do want that training and will respond to it because most officers are pretty pragmatic. They want to be effective at doing their jobs. They don't want to be disliked or hated. And therefore, if we can give officers skills on how to engage in a conversation, how to recognize that when you're wearing a uniform, that creates an inherent barrier, whether you like it or not, in terms of having conversations, particularly with communities that have come to fear or hate that uniform. So even if you're the most well-intentioned officer out there, or even if that's the neighborhood you're from, and a lot of our cops are from the neighborhoods they serve, but that uniform still can create a barrier. So how do we get beyond that? And there's training for that. Training also in the area of unconscious bias. Again, not the total solution, but at least getting officers to think about what biases they carry and how they can get beyond that. So that's important. Hiring, just very quickly, and I'll wrap it up here, but hiring also. We've got to hire so that our forces look a lot more like the communities that we serve. And that has to be a deliberate, conscious, ongoing effort. You can't just say you're open to the idea of having a diverse workforce. You have to actively seek it. And you have to create kind of a tipping point, whether you're talking about an environment that women want to come work in because they see that there are other women in the workforce, that they have an equal opportunity for assignments that are attractive to them, that they can get promoted, until you reach that tipping point, whether it's for women, whether it's for African Americans, whether it's for any other minority group. LGBT community. I mean, are you kidding? I mean, who wants to work in a department where you're surrounded by folks that you have historically been oppressed by? So you really have to work to create that climate. Finally, accountability. And this is the hardest piece of all, because I can tell you right now, I mean, I have an administrative group of captains and 2 deputy chiefs that I think are really on the same page I am about wanting to hold folks accountable in our organization for misconduct. And we do our best, but it is very, very challenging. And there are external factors there that we don't have complete control over. In California, as in many other states, for example, there's a police officer Bill of Rights. Now, I'm not going to lay all of the issues with accountability on that one thing. There are many other pieces. But let's be real about it. If I have a complaint, a serious complaint, for example, about an officer, and I investigate that thoroughly and I reach a finding, I cannot share the results of that investigation, anything really about the investigation itself, or about the discipline with the public as a result of that police officer Bill of Rights. So I can talk the transparency talk as much, and I'm as good as the next guy when it comes to saying how, that's the new buzzword, we all want to be transparent, right? But I can't be transparent because the law won't let me. And a good many of the legislators in our Bay Area even, who would sit in an audience like this and say amen and right on and we agree, they're all Democrats, for example, and yet you go back and you look at their voting record, and when it comes to lining up behind whatever it is the police unions want, they're right there. Every single one of them, checking that off. So I'm just saying, that's some of the challenges with the accountability.
Right, that's very helpful. I'd like to stay with the question of accountability for the moment and ask Chief Cook about your experience with that particular set of issues.
Well, accountability continues to be an issue in law enforcement with respect to how it's litigated. We get a lot of frivolous lawsuits filed against the police. We get a lot of lawsuits filed that a lot of times the villages are just more willing to settle than put some investigative skills into actually what the officer did in an effort to get him removed from the police department. So that union is a big deal. You're supposed to negotiate in good terms, in good faith, but you find that a lot of the unions today, the union negotiation process is hostile, and even when it comes to discipline, you find nowadays that the union will file a grievance and even want to push a minor grievance all the way to arbitration, costing the villages and towns money. So that's one of the big inhibitors. The primary thing, though, I believe, is that police chiefs have to understand who they work for. You don't work for the mayor, you work for the people. That's the top level of accountability. That's who I'm beholden to in terms of job performance. And the people are going to be the ultimate deciders of whether or not you stay in that particular position. And it's something that you can't fake that. Yeah. During these election periods, to give you a prime example, the mayor, he just left. So now I get a new mayor, and it's his prerogative to remove me and get someone else. But when you go out and engage yourself in the community, those are the people who come up and say, no, he's been invisible, we see a change, and things of that nature. No longer can we stand by and be complacent to these issues of corruption, nepotism, as was said earlier, no police accountability. I think you can't just talk this stuff. You actually have to have the courage as an administrator to do it.
Well, it's interesting that you speak as someone with a constituency you're answering to.
Yes.
The way you talk about,
responsive to the community. That's how, when you look at the organizational structure of government, the voters are at the top of the chain. It's nice to have a mayor there, but I look past the mayor. I look to the point where the mayor is going to be leaving, and then it comes whether or not I'm going to be retained as a police chief. So that is where and why I constantly communicate. Like every month I'm at the neighborhood community meetings. We got 5 subdivisions in the village of Glenwood, and part of my assessment of that department when I got there, I had gotten some complaints from some of the residents on how the police would communicate with them. They were consistently being punitive to the resident for minor infractions, and I'm totally against that. I think a lot of times in terms of putting forth law enforcement, officer could be less punitive to a resident and educate them about whatever particular violation they committed. With respect to trying to bridge that gap in the communities, it was police officers that had been there 10 or 15 years, and a lot of the folks didn't know them. So I started requiring that a police officer, I started with the supervisors, each month, out of those 5 neighborhood meetings, it's got to be a police officer at that meeting to read the crime blotter and to explain what's going on in a particular neighborhood. Now that was twofold, not only to do what I just stated, but it was also to unveil who the police were. And hopefully, in that communications and that networking in a non-adversarial situation, we could start to build a relationship. If an incident happened in a particular neighborhood, they could say, oh, I remember him, it's Officer Jones, he's at our neighborhood meetings, and things of that nature. So it's an uphill battle with what's going on in law enforcement, but you have to look to the private sector also. I believe that established customer service, and you never hear that in law enforcement, but I do believe in a customer service-based policy, meaning that, you can put all the mission statements in the world on the wall and talk values and all of that, but if you're not providing just consistent customer service with dignity and respect, not only to the homeowners, but to the prisoners, to the school children, to the business district, those are your customers. And
So let me just open it up for a minute and
Yes, sir.
ask a couple of the customers sitting next to you
Yes, sir.
for reactions.
Sure. I actually just sort of wanted to pose a question on this obviously very important topic of accountability to Chief Cook, Chief Magnus. And the question is, what do you think about body cameras on police? So it would seem like they would hold advantages for lots of people involved in this. They might deter some of the worst behavior. They might make it much easier for you to investigate allegations of misconduct. And at the same time, they might be very useful for police in exonerating themselves against false or baseless charges as well. Obviously, they're expensive, but it would seem like the sort of intervention that might be well worth the cost. I'm curious what you think, or whether your departments have policies about them.
Well, I think it's going to be as was put forth when law enforcement went to in-car cameras. A lot of times, the police officer has an apprehension about being videotaped, but it was to their advantage because a lot of times it exonerated them on a lot of issues. So, we have to follow what's going to create public value, what's going to create a cohesiveness between the public and the police. And if body cameras is the way to go, it's not something that we should be afraid of.
I'll just support that as well. I think that, but I'll say this: I don't think body cameras are the whole. I think that's a piece of the solution, but body cameras do nothing to actually build relationships.
Right.
Mm-hmm. They are an important tool for purposes of accountability, and that can swing both ways because it benefits officers when claims are made that are false or frivolous, and it benefits community when the behavior of the officer is outside of policy or law. No question about it, that has value. But, in my community, for example, our current policy relative to body cameras is that it's a little more complicated for the officer because we don't tell them they have to have it on every time they're outside of the car. In fact, the community doesn't want that. We have folks who want to tell officers things that are going on to prevent violence, to provide tips to solve crimes, or just to have a friendly conversation. And they don't want to feel like every time they have an officer into their home or they're having a positive conversation with an officer on the street that they're being recorded. And the officer doesn't want that either. So we're taking a little more nuanced approach to this. That's, different departments have gone about this in different ways, but I think they definitely have value.
Well, and that's a perfect segue, this idea of relationships, to the work that you're doing, LaCreshia, with Bridging the Divide. How does that project work, and what are you learning from the encounters that youth and police are having in the conversation?
Yeah, before I go to Bridging the Divide, I do want to talk about body cameras because, as you mentioned, I'm a part of another group called Black Youth Project 100, and we produce the agenda to keep us safe. And in this agenda to keep us safe, there were policy recommendations around policing and safety, and body cameras was included in that, but we were kind of split on that. Like I said, they're just recommendations on a national level, but we think that, these strategies are things that the people in the community should get together and decide on. But we were very split in the organization about body cameras because we saw the tape of Eric Garner, right? And it did nothing to help people get justice for the police who committed crimes. And so I'm still left wondering, like, how do we hold police accountable? And I'll get to that a little bit later. So now I'll go to the Bridging the Divide project. So Bridging the Divide project was an idea that came from one of my, my partners on this youth advisory board committee that I was a part of for the Illinois Juvenile Justice Commission. His name was Miguel, and he had positive interactions with police in his neighborhood. And so he decided one day that, what would it look like if other people in, neighborhoods had positive interactions with police? So he came up with this idea to bring police and youth together for one summer to just have positive interactions, to have dialogue. And so last year we did that. We brought police officers and youth together. We used a creative project to do that. We had this photo contest where we asked officers and youth and community members to take pictures of beauty and strength in their communities, and then submit it to this contest where they would get money. And then along with the contest, there were conversations about community. There was conversations about safety, and we ended up having peace circles and what we call community cafes, where we talked about policing specifically. All this happened before Michael Brown. So right when Michael Brown happened, we were just wrapping up the tail end of our project, and we were left feeling very incomplete. We were left feeling like, this wasn't enough. The conversations are great, but the conversations aren't change, right? And so I've been really struggling as a coordinator of this project with accountability, right? So one thing that I came up with, because in addition to the photo contest on the front end and these conversations with community on the front end, Vanessa Wesley, who's in the audience, she's an officer that works with CAPS officers, and she trains the Chicago police around community engagement. And so she welcomed this project. She brought the community group in, and she started training police on adolescent development. She started talking to them about disproportionate minority contact, right? And so that was all happening on the back end of the project. And even though that was great, I still was left feeling very unsettled. I'm like, these conversations, these trainings are great, but nothing is changing. And then, so I figured we're now planning the project again. And if you guys are interested, I welcome you to come up to me or Vanessa, who is, she don't want to be recognized, but you could come up to me and I'll definitely connect you to her. But we're trying to figure out these next steps, and I figure that we can't have true accountability, right, if we're just having trainings or we're just having conversations, but there's no change in the police department, right?
Can I jump in there? That's a really helpful formulation and I think we could extend to the things that the two chiefs were saying as well. All sorts of good ideas, humane, sensible interventions and initiatives, but without accountability, it's hard to see how that changes the sorts of sense of injury and grievance that we've heard from people in the course of this conference, and particularly from young people. I'd like to turn to Adam Green, who might be able to bring us a historical perspective on some of these themes that aren't new themes. Certainly we've heard it in the last session, all sorts of grounds to regard the fundamental police accountability issue, the fundamental issue of abuse coupled with impunity, as just being intractable. That change, no change, or whatever you said a moment ago. What's history tell us?
Well, history, as is often the case, it tells a complicated, somewhat contradictory story. I have to say, history understood on the surface tells a story that is sobering and maybe even discouraging. But one must always hope, one must always struggle, one must always be creative in terms of trying to figure out a way through what appear to be conditions that aren't possible. Case in point, there are a number of people here involved with groups, including, of course, LaCreshia, BYP 100, Project NIA, We Charge Genocide, a number of groups that came together with a group of activists and scholars and researchers, Chicago Torture Justice Memorial Project, that in turn stood on the shoulders of a number of groups that had been active for 20 years, including Black People Against Torture, and achieved a conceded settlement, which is reported in the media as a great idea that was hatched by the alderman in Chicago and the mayor. But make no mistake about this, this was about a great deal of initiative, a great deal of pressure, a great deal of demonstration and citizen action, including youth citizen action, that was able to achieve, as I understand it as a historian, the first comprehensive settlement in which a city admits fault across the board in relation to police practices, commits an amount of money, $5.4 million, in terms of being able to establish a pool to provide reparations for the class of individuals who suffered torture, in this case, of course, under Commander Burge and the people that worked with him, and that the city is committed in terms of instituting curriculums at the 8th and 10th grade level, funding eventually a memorial that will make permanent the recognition within the city of police torture. These are things that were fought for years and years and years, not least of which by the city, of course, which put out $20 million to defend Commander Burge and other officers against charges that were brought against them by torture survivors. So history gives some examples, in this case, the history of the last 2 weeks, of ways in which people coming together and struggling, fighting, framing the argument clearly, making smart strategic choices, can move things forward. And actually, I think it's a moment, given that this is a landmark move in relation to this, not only in Chicago, but nationally, to give applause to those people that are in the middle of that campaign, because it's very important.
Now, I could just interject just briefly one thing. The same day that agreement, which is everything you say it is, was announced, at the same city council meeting, it was also announced that there was a $5 million settlement for the family of Laquan Mcdonald, the young man I described being executed on the street. So again, that sense of the underlying resistance.
Right. But this raises, I think, a very important point. And I want to be clear, I'm not someone who researches primarily questions of police-community relations. I'm not someone, except only in a couple of cases, who's actually been directly involved as a professional scholar in terms of addressing these issues. So I don't want to claim the authority of any of the other members of the panel here, including, of course, those that are engaged as young activists in terms of this. But I think a clear distinction has to be drawn in our conversations about speaking about reform measures and speaking about accountability measures. Reform measures are voluntary choices, admittedly sometimes under duress, that are taken by institutions that say, okay, we understand that things have gotten a little bit out of control. We understand that we aren't, in fact, instituting best practices, and we're going to try to find a way to change things. And sometimes these reform measures are actually very important in terms of framing and pushing the conversation forward. But to pick up a theme that came from the last panel, Accountability measures, meaningful accountability measures, the simplest way to speak about that is that that's an instance of power sharing. That's an instance of redistributing power. And at the same time that people are talking about reform or accountability, another word that has to be brought into this conversation that has to change in terms of the ways in which communities and police face each other is the word authority. So long as police departments or prosecutors finding ways to maintain the sanctity of police action without any regard for its impact on citizens, so long as authority is not something that is redistributed to some way, which is another way of speaking about power being redistributed, you're really not going to move this needle. I mean, when I guess I would think about this less as a historian and more as a citizen, as a person who's grown up in this country. I moved to Los Angeles from the East Coast in 1992 in June, 2 months after the unrest in Los Angeles, after the acquittal of the officers who had beaten Rodney King, another example in which video evidence did absolutely nothing. And in fact, it's quite amazing to think about that video being slowed down and deconstructed by Sergeant Kuhn and others to be a manual in proper police procedure, rather than an instance and an evidence of brutalizing another human being. So the ways in which you take evidence, video evidence in this case, and present it, frame it, narrate it, contextualize it, can make it seem completely different from what it was before. So, I mean, I think with all due respect, the evidence that can be brought into a discussion is only as good as the perspective and the intelligence that we bring to bear in terms of analyzing that evidence. I think without, and I'm not as immersed, there are other people that are here, and there are probably other people here on stage who can speak about this. Without meaningful accountability measures that are intended to be measures of finding ways to redistribute power so that citizens and police are facing each other with more of a sense of equity, more of a sense of the ways in which if they violate the interests and prerogatives of one or the other, then there is going to be some price to pay. Right now, that exists in relation to police in terms of citizens. It simply does not exist in terms of citizens in relation to police, and especially for young people of color. Well, how do we get there? There are not a lot of lessons in relation to history. There are very, very few, if any, instances where there are meaningful accountability, meaning civilian review, civilian oversight bodies in relation to the police departments around the country. So I'm talking pie in the sky. I'm speaking of fantasy in relation to even bringing this up. Well, I think there are two ways in which to say perhaps I'm not. One is that getting to the point where we could have this in a few communities and perhaps in many communities is fundamentally about establishing a political process, perhaps of finding a way to overturn police bills of rights, perhaps in terms of electing mayors who are actually going to understand community safety more on the basis of community trust, rather than how many police you have on the streets. And the analogy that I come up with in terms of saying this actually could happen, and indeed, if it's going to happen, it would happen very soon because of how deeply people are aware right now of the crisis of community police relations that exists within the United States right now.
I like to say that these community police relationships are a byproduct of a larger system.
Well, they are, yes.
Yeah, meaning that if you're going to look at reform, you need to look at the judiciary. You need to look at the attorneys that now the point in a police-related shooting with respect to litigation is for the village or the city or whatever to get a summary judgment. So what you've seen is a shift away from internal investigations and the formal investigation being done by an outside entity or task force. In Cook County, it's the Cook County Public Integrity Team. See, you can't put all of this on law enforcement when the whole wheel is broken. Let's look at law enforcement as being one spoke. In this circle of things that aren't right. And until people, meaning us, start to recognize that and be willing to address all of the spokes in terms of reform, then I think it'll happen. But not just by singling out law enforcement and saying that law enforcement is the issue. It's a whole bunch of things that's the issue. The Cook County State's Attorney ain't prosecuting nobody. It's a whole bunch of stuff that I see as a police chief here. And I say, well, how do you get this out to the masses? The people really don't know the integral workings of law enforcement. You know, we want to powder coat it and put it all on the police officer, but the fact of the matter is the system been broke.
Well,
hold on, and the attorneys and the judges in these systems, and even the Supreme Court has some responsibility and should take the weight of some of what's going on today. Rodney King happened 25 years ago. 68 was before that. So where do we say, you know, where do we fix this? We get on these bandwagons of talk about reform every time it's something big happen. And then they want to make the police department the whipping boy of this crisis. And I think that's unfair to the police department. It's not correct, it's not all right. And I'll be the first one. I grew up in the projects here. The police, I was afraid of the police coming up, but I knew that all police officers weren't against me. Actually, it was a police officer that was stationed in my high school that encouraged me to go into law enforcement. Officer Abraham Hawthorne, he encouraged me to, and then I come here to this university. The university got some responsibility too.
Oh yeah.
Absolutely. Because this is a primary institution in our community, right in the heart of the black community. And you know, a couple of years ago when when Dr. Hawkins passed away, they telling me that they don't have any money for Upward Bound. That's what got me out of the projects down here and received the tutoring and guidance that got me where I am today. So, you know, don't sit back here and just look at it as a law enforcement issue. It's everybody's issue. And everybody got to take part of this. You know, I heard people say, I watched a kid in Allgale Gardens that was beat to death with a baseball bat. And not one person in that block, you know, we go by blocks out in Allgale Gardens, it's block 6, you know, not one person said anything about that crime. And we think that's okay. Well, it ain't okay because it's someone in that police department that cares about you. And if you think that that's not true, you're dead wrong.
So I think everybody agrees to the extent that we're
they do.
We're trying to place these issues in multiple larger contexts.
Well, that's why I asked, where's your scientific research with respect to these issues? How are you categorizing it, and how are you laying out the central plan to address them scientifically?
Okay.
This is a scientific institution.
So a couple of things really quickly. I know that Professor Green wants to get in really quickly to respond. I will say that the university is doing a ton around research-based practices in this community in Chicago on crime and poverty, education.
Only ones I've seen is a crime lab.
But let me go to Professor Green in response to that.
And let me actually, I'll defer because you had your hand up first, and then I'll come after.
Okay, thank you for allowing me to speak now. I will say...
It's a little bit like rebounding.
Yeah. So I want to address the university as well, right? Even though BYP, my organization, we function from here, I know that there's been a lot of activists who've been trying to address the lack of a trauma center that serves, you know, adolescents. I mean, serves beyond adolescents, right? And then there's also the issue of policing you have here, right? Every time I walk onto this campus as a non-student, as a person from the community, I feel like I don't know, I just feel overly policed on this campus. And there have been many community groups or activist groups, even on campus, who've been trying to address that. And I don't know if they were invited here today, but I think that they should have been a part of this conversation as well. Because how can you talk about policing in a broader community, but I think it's great that you have research and all that other stuff, but how are you then policing in a way, addressing the issue of policing on your own campus? But I also want to address this issue that everyone should be accountable, because that's something I believe in my heart. That's something that I know. I didn't become an activist because I felt like it, right? Like, I became an activist because people I know died. I had a friend who was shot and killed. Actually, not a friend, a person I dated, right? Like, my first kiss, like it tremendously impacted me. And I had an uncle who was killed by the police, right? And so I want to address this, what you were talking about, right? How people picking on the police, and it's a part of a larger system. But I agree, we do need to address the judges, the attorneys, everybody. But police kill people, right? People have died, right? The harm, the trauma that police have committed is irreversible. It's irreversible. And I think we have to stop pretending that that's not happening, right? Like, and it's not just the police, you're right, you're absolutely right. Who Anita Alvarez decides to prosecute, or how she goes about police when we have cases like Rakia Boyd, right? Like that, those have real consequences, right? They impact the community. And what I wanted to talk about earlier with the Bridge and Divide project in terms of accountability is that, yes, now when we bring community and police together, we're not just gonna have these conversations. Like, that's unacceptable, right? Because now that youth have been vulnerable in our space, they've told us things that have happened to them with police, and we can't just walk away from that, right? That's neglect. That's neglect. Right? If you hear these problems and you do nothing about it, that is neglect, right? And as constituents, as students, as all these things in this revolving around this institution, or the university specifically, like, you have an obligation as well, right? To do something beyond just having these conversations. And so that's what we're going to try to do, right? We're going to listen to the community, like you were talking about. You can't just listen, right? Now, if the community complains about something, now you have to do something about that, right? And now the community is complaining about interactions with the police, and the police have to change their practices. And how does that change happen? I want to get back to what you were talking about in terms of civilian oversight, right? Like, I'm a part of another group, I forget their name, the National Alliance Against Racial Repression, I forget, but they have an ordinance called CPAC, which stands for Civilian Police Accountability Council, right? And I've heard people talking about this, but these people have been doing this work for such a long time, and they've been fighting way before these high-profile cases have been happening recently, right? They've been consistently fighting, and they haven't been getting the recognition that they need. And I think it would benefit the police department, especially people like you, right, who are concerned about, the mayor coming in and him being able to annex a superintendent who's trying to do good work, because with CPAC, they actually want to allow for the civilian council to decide who becomes the next police chief.
As I worked 30 years in the city of Evanston as a chief of detectives, and we were under some pressure from some misconduct by some police officers, and we actually implemented a citizen police review board, and I found it easy to work with. I'm not against any of that. Well, what I'm saying is it's a holistic solution that we got to take, and everybody got to be involved, not just the police administrators. We need the whole community to be involved with pushing law enforcement activities in a positive direction. And Chuck Wexler from Perth addressed that at the Perth conference last summer. We got to ask the critical questions as police administrators to ourselves. And you can't be in a predicament with your police department due to some negative activity involving a police officer and be afraid to critically look at what that officer did that's wrong in the eyes of the public. That's your job. And I'm not trying to run from that. I don't think many of the chiefs that I know are not trying to run from that. We powwow about how do we break down some of these barriers that inhibit us, like the Police Bill of Rights, the union. A lot of people don't even know how a police shooting is investigated under the Police Officer Bill of Rights. When a police officer gets involved in a shooting, he goes to the hospital. We can't talk with him for 3 days and things of that nature. A lot of people don't understand the dynamics of this. And then coming in with an attorney, they're afforded the same rights you are as a citizen, as a police officer. So that makes the investigation move at a certain pace. And education in terms of how the police officers and the departments in America actually work is a critical thinking issue for you all, because I already know it. But when you all get it and you all get behind us on it, I think that way we can make some real change with some of these state legislators.
I just want to jump in 1 second here, because I think that there's a little bit of, I take issue a little bit with, I think, a false dichotomy between the idea of, there's sort of this, reform on the one hand, which is, which it seems like you're significantly discounting, and then accountability on the other hand. I think that's both, I just don't think that's a productive way of looking at it. I think you can have both, and that both are incredibly important. On the one hand, I think you have to have police chiefs and others in police departments around the country who want reform and who are working hard to bring about different models of reform within their agencies. For one thing, policing varies so much around the country. What makes eminent sense to you in Chicago is really going to be looked at in many ways very differently in my community or in other communities around the country. So this has to be, for one thing, a very local process, although I don't disagree there need to be some national standards around data collection. There need to be strings attached to federal money that's given out to police departments. I get all of that. But I think we do need to recognize that reform efforts within police departments are important, because we are going to be the ones who hopefully are influencing other chiefs and setting a path to help guide them towards better measures of accountability and responsiveness within their community. There is absolutely a role for a push of accountability from residents and activists. I don't take away any of that. I think what I've heard yesterday and today, that's incredibly important. That pressure needs to be there. But I don't think this is a test of one versus the other. You need reform-minded chiefs, and you need community activism. And if everybody's work is doing their part and is engaged as possible, and even supporting each other when possible, and on many things we should be able to support each other. I think that's when we're going to see true progress. But if it's equally wrong if I think just reform, my efforts, the chief's efforts at reform, if that's going to do the trick. I get it. It's not. But I would also argue that just this hard push towards this entirely different model of accountability is also, I don't see that doing the job alone either.
So let's give Adam and Jonathan a moment, and then we'll go to the audience.
Let me ask the question, though I take the correction, and I certainly consider it. Isn't part of the problem, though, that reform is something that at times you see within departments, accountability in an effective sense, we've never seen. And so part of the reason why I'm making the strong distinction is to say, at this moment, 2014, 2015, these are problems that have existed in the United States for centuries. Right now, as a historian, in my humble opinion, we are at a point where we have the potential to actually say, this is something that is so important, we need to get this right now. And getting it right now does mean not just thinking about this as a problem of police, but thinking about this as a problem of joblessness. Thinking about this as a problem of inadequate civic institutions, whether they're educational, whether they're health, whether they're housing, et cetera. Thinking about this as a problem of cynical disinvestment in relation to communities over a couple of generations, whether we're talking about the West Coast, the Midwest, the East Coast, wherever. I mean, I won't go into the statistics in relation to what's happened over the last 40 years in the United States in terms of the communities that you live at. I think we're all familiar with it. I think many of us have lived with it and suffered consequences in relation to it. The reason why I draw that distinction is that there is a crisis in relation to trust right now. And unless people make a commitment to saying we want to build trust in an effective way, and dare I say, in a new way, in relation to how police and communities relate. Unless we do that, we're going to come back to these same problems again and again and again. So I take your point.
But okay, so that may very well be true, but here's the thing, and I think actually citizen review boards or accountability boards are a good example of this, because I see even in the area where I'm at, in the Bay Area, there are several communities, several very large communities that have a long history around civil rights and advocacy and self-determination for various groups who have enacted so-called citizen review boards with all of these same goals of accountability in mind that you're describing. And quite candidly, and there's research that backs this up, the results have been dismal in terms of real accountability. You're not seeing the kind of substantive change that people had in mind when they created those bodies. They're politically weighted and interfered with. Folks who are making decisions don't really understand the environment that they're regulating or that they're trying to seek accountability around. They're easily co-opted. There are many cases where the chiefs are recommending tougher consequences for officers than these so-called citizen review boards. So I'm saying that I think a better model comes when we have, yes, the push for that kind of reform combined with an sort of, I'll use the word, insider knowledge of how policing actually works from a number of progressive-minded reform chiefs working together to create a new approach to doing this, and that either one, separate from the other, is, I don't think it's going to succeed.
Real quick, and I know because you do deserve to speak, I want to say that in Chicago, this hybrid that you're talking about, right, between police and the civilians coming together, it exists through the Independent Review Authority, and it's a joke. Like, people do not go there, they do not trust it, and it's because we've allowed police to co-opt it, right? And everything that you just said about these civilian accountability groups, that happens within the police, right? Isn't it a political thing? Like, isn't there corruption? Like, I feel like we cannot be afraid to try something different, and like, people are not even giving it a chance, really, in a true civilian way, right? Like, I'm not talking about like some group of vigilante, civilian oversight people. No, we're talking about making this an arm of the city, right? That replaces the Independent Review Authority, right? And I think that change is necessary, and I hear you when you say, there's a difference between reform and authority. This project that I'm doing with the Bridging the Divide is an example of reform, right? Because the police are working with us to do it, but if the police aren't held accountable to these suggestions, to the stories that are happening, not even stories, the real experiences of the youth that they're interacting with in these peace circles, then there's no change, and then it's not worth it, right? Like, so I agree that we need both, but like, we need for the police to stop policing themselves, right? I think that you guys are great chiefs, but like, I think that the problem is the culture that exists currently doesn't reward people who are good within the police department, right? Like, and we need to do something to address that. And the code of silence is not going to end by having a good chief, because you guys are good chiefs, right? But it hasn't ended that. So what do we do to end this code of silence? What do we do to hold police accountable? To fire them when they do
but
crimes.
That's a good case in point, and this speaks to exactly what Chief Cook was saying, which is that this is the problem, which is it's very easy, and we can all get the hand clapping and the show of support when somebody says, and fire them. Oh, right. No, I really, you don't think I want to fire bad cops in my department? And most of my managers want that too. That's a little more complicated than just, snap your fingers and they're fired. Cops, the reality is cops have a lot of due process rights, a lot of rights. We're going to have to figure out how we address that issue. The reality of just, POBAR, that's just going to get thrown out. You're kidding yourself if you think that's just going to happen. There was a great deal of political capital that went into creating Police Officer Bill of Rights in the first place. In fact, it's expanded. It's not diminished. This is going to have to be done thoughtfully with calculation. We're going to have to really, if you want to change a system, you really have to understand it. You can't just be in opposition to it.
Right.
Well, the same.
I'm sorry. Get Jonathan in, because he's been waiting patiently. Because I think one of the key questions here is, what would effective accountability look like? And I'm wondering, from your perspective, Jonathan, what are the factors, what are the ingredients that would make accountability truly work?
Sure. Well, I think that what's important here is that there's change that needs to happen at a lot of different institutional levels,
Yes.
and none of them is mutually exclusive of the other. And many of the problems, I think that Chief Magnus and LaCreshia are pointing to the same issue, which is that when people who are supposed to be overseeing one another are in fact sort of in cahoots with one another, you don't get effective oversight. We don't get anything that looks like accountability. So we have a problem when the prosecutors who are supposed to be prosecuting police who've engaged in misconduct are actually reliant on police for their casework and have been sort of forming relationships with police for years and years. We certainly saw that in Ferguson, where the prosecutors there had long-standing relationships with police. So we need different prosecutors who are cordoned off, who are not reliant on police for their casework, and who are able to then go and act independently to prosecute police misfeasance on a regular basis. We need external accountability in police departments, so we need the ability to, fire officers who behaved badly and to prosecute them. And we also need internal change, where police forces try to change their culture and train their officers differently. None of these things is mutually exclusive of the other. Now, it might be that it's hard to assemble the political will for it. I think when Chief Magnus says, the police officer's Bill of Rights isn't going anywhere, that sounds quite right to me. And there's quite a lot of political power behind the current system. There are a lot of people who have a lot of vested interest in maintaining police culture the way it exists currently. But if we can form enough political power to sort of to instantiate change at lots of these different institutional levels, there's no reason why we can't have change coming from within the police department, accountability from without the police department, change at the level of judges and prosecutors as well, and change within the community. There's no reason why people in the community can't simultaneously be reaching out to the police. I heard yesterday great stories about how students at Hyde Park Academy are reaching out to the police officers who work in their schools, inviting them into the classrooms to sit down with them, talk to them, get to know them. There's no reason why this can't be bilateral and multilateral among all of these different institutional actors.
Yeah, it's a lot of police punishment dished out by the Justice Department. They have a class that, the FBI has a class that they go around and teach to local government. It's called The Color of Law, Public Integrity. And in that class, they talk about the prosecutions of police officers that are taking place in Illinois. And they're doing this all over the United States. So a lot of this in terms of trust and building trust has to do, as the chief said, with a lot of people coming up to speed on what actually is being done in the law enforcement community to punish wrongdoers. They really are doing it, in my opinion, although there are many people unsatisfied with the current state. But that ain't changed. As far as I can go back as a kid, it was 1968. They were asking for what you are asking for then, now. And it cools off and it heats up. When will it sustain itself in terms of pushing forward with, and when will the institutions that have the power and connections to do it, do it? When will they look at the black community in other than just an experiment? That's what I want to know. When will they look at how our part of the city looks different from other parts? We live in one of the most segregated cities in America, right here in Chicago. And I don't hear nobody talking about that. That's some of the things we need to talk about, and then maybe things could get better. You know, these hiring processes for police, I'm gonna tell you when I get a police officer. When the Fire and Police Commission bring them into my office and say, hi, this is Officer so-and-so. Oh, first time I ever met him. Those are the processes you gotta look at, the civil service process and the Fire and Police Commission process. Sure. In terms of when you talk about reform. These are the true barriers to the police chiefs having a little bit more authority in ridding these departments or these officers.
Let me
Chief
just do a
Cook,
quick
I'm sorry.
check. I'm going to come to you for the last word, Elizabeth. I just want to contextualize where we are in the program. We're going to give the last word to Professor Green. We're going to take a pause, and then it's all, for the balance of the time, audience conversation around solutions and where we go from here. So just as a quick time check on that. And
So-
back to you, Adam.
Just a point, Chief Cook, I agree, and I very much endorse your idea that this needs to be thought about holistically. There are a lot of people that talk about segregation. I mean, when I was asked to testify at Commander Burge's sentencing hearing, the heart of my testimony was to talk about the consequences of segregation on the South Side, specifically empowering John Burge to be able to operate in the way that he did. What people don't do is connect these conversations.
Yes, sir.
What people do is that they don't connect these conversations. I think that there are probably academics who don't do this. Perhaps activists do it a great deal, but they could do it better. Perhaps police chiefs know to do it. Perhaps the two of you do it, and perhaps many others don't do it. We all need to do that much more. I want to go back to the point that Professor Masur brought up in terms of talking about political will. Political will is something that can be marshaled, not just by waiting to see how people come out in terms of an election. People can push political will to move forward. If you had asked people in 1935 whether or not segregated education could be ended in the United States, most people would say, well, you know, that'd be a nice thing, but there's really not the political will to do it. 20 years later, it was done because people pushed against it. If you ask people to say, can we possibly enfranchise people?
Not to, I mean, look at where that is, though, now. We still have one of the most segregated education systems.
True. And that points out that just because you win a victory at the constitutional level or because you convert a couple of presidents in terms of the ways that they see this, that doesn't solve the problem. Because you are talking about a political process in which people have interests that they want to recover. So there are people who want to see segregated education restored. There are people, as we have seen over the last 5 years, who want to see groups of non-white voters disenfranchised in the United States. You have seen people who want to be able to engage in more aggressive, more unaccountable, more violent policing in relation to communities of color. We know that that's there. That's why at the start of this, perhaps not as well as I could have, I said that this is fundamentally a political question. And where we are right now, which I think we should all agree that we appreciate, is at a political moment. People are not unaware about what the stakes are at this moment. Both those that suffer the consequences of this right now, and those who can look 5 or 10 years down the road and say the kind of country that this country is going to be if we don't institute some greater capacity for trust between the whole justice structure and system, and one that I would say needs to be greatly reconstructed, and the citizenry at large. If we don't do that, then we may have reforms, we may have effective policing at the local level, we may have universities where we can talk about this at conferences, but we are going to have more social strife. We are going to have more distrust. We are going to have more costs to pay as a society up and down the line. So this is a moment for us to say, do we want to get behind something like civilian accountability, effective accountability? Something like, for instance, that would say a young, intelligent, activist person in a community has every right to stand on one of these commissions as an academic with a degree or a lawyer who has prosecuted cases like this. That's the kind of accountability that might actually work because it instills confidence at the community level. And confidence is the basis of trust.
That is a perfect moment to segue into our next conversation. I want to introduce Emmett House to lead us through this final conversation with all of you, retired attorney and a key member of the Youth Police Project team. As he makes his way up here, please join me in thanking Adam Green, Chris Magnus, Demitrous Cook, LaCreshia Birts, Jonathan Masur. Thank you all very much for that great conversation.